By early 1967, the war in Vietnam had shifted into a new and more dangerous phase, one in which American commanders believed they had identified a decisive opportunity to strike at the Viet Cong's heart in the South. Years of limited engagements, search and destroy missions, and incremental pacification efforts had produced only mixed results. Intelligence pointed toward War Zone C, a vast, heavily forested region along the Cambodian border that had long served as a sanctuary, logistics hub, and command center for communist forces. The area's dense canopy, interlaced trail networks, hidden bunkers and tunnel systems, and proximity to an international border made it an ideal place for the Viet Cong to regroup, resupply, and direct operations while remaining difficult to pin down. American planners believed elements of the Central Office for South Vietnam might be operating there, and they conceived Operation Junction City as a large, coordinated effort to disrupt that network, destroy caches, and force the enemy into a confrontation that U.S. firepower could decisively resolve. The scale of Junction City was unprecedented for the conflict up to that point. It combined airborne insertions, airmobile assaults, conventional ground advances, and sustained artillery and air support. Tens of thousands of American and Allied troops were mobilized, supported by helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and a complex logistical tail that had to keep men and machines supplied in a remote, hostile environment. The operation was not a single neat battle, but a campaign of movement probing and attrition designed to deny the Viet Cong freedom of movement and sanctuary. Within this larger campaign, Junction City II was launched in early April as a renewed push to maintain pressure in War Zone C, to follow up on earlier gains, and to exploit any intelligence that might lead to the capture or destruction of high-value enemy leadership and infrastructure. Among the units tasked with this difficult work was the 173d Airborne Brigade, the Sky Soldiers, a formation that had earned a reputation for toughness and aggressiveness since its arrival in Vietnam in 1965. The brigade soldiers were trained for rapid insertion, airborne operations, and air assault tactics. They were accustomed to operating in small units, moving quickly through difficult terrain, and reacting to ambushes and sudden contact. Within the brigade, the 2D Battalion of the 503d Infantry Regiment carried a particularly demanding role during Junction City II. Their mission required them to conduct air assaults into contested landing zones, establish blocking positions to cut off enemy escape routes, search for enemy units and caches, and prevent Viet Cong forces from slipping across the Cambodian border. These tasks demanded not only physical endurance and marksmanship, but also patience, discipline, and the ability to make split-second decisions under stress. On the morning of April 7, 1967, the operation began in earnest. Before dawn, artillery units opened up, saturating suspected enemy positions with high-explosive rounds intended to soften landing zones and disrupt any Viet Cong preparations. The thunder of artillery was meant to mask the sound of incoming helicopters and to unsettle defenders, but the jungle's acoustics and the enemy's habit of dispersal meant that bombardment could only do so much. Helicopters from a 1st Aviation Brigade then began lifting troops into designated landing zones scattered throughout War Zone C. For the men of the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, the moments before insertion were a mixture of ritual and raw anxiety. Weapons checked, radios tested, maps reviewed, and last-minute orders given. The open doors of the helicopters framed a world of green and shadow below, and every soldier knew that landing zones were often the most dangerous places on the battlefield. Initial landings on April 7th met scattered resistance. As helicopters descended through the canopy, small arms fire erupted in several locations. Door gunners returned suppressive fire while infantrymen jumped into tall grass and dense undergrowth, immediately seeking cover and forming hasty perimeters. The jungle concealed bunkers, spider holes, and concealed firing positions. The enemy's ability to blend into the terrain meant that every step forward could bring sudden contact. Platoons moved out to secure their landing zones, pushing outward in cautious sweeps to prevent surprise attacks and to locate signs of enemy presence. The day's operations were methodical: search, clear, and hold. Troops combed abandoned villages, inspected huts and wells, and followed trails that might lead to caches or to the enemy themselves. Signs of recent Viet Cong activity were everywhere. Fresh footprints in muddy stream beds, the faint smell of smoke from recently extinguished cooking fires, cleverly concealed bunkers, and hidden rice caches told a story of a force that had been operating in the area until very recently. Yet the Viet Cong rarely sought large, set-piece battles. Instead, they favored mobility and discretion, striking when conditions favored them and melting away when faced with superior firepower. This pattern frustrated American commanders who sought a decisive engagement. It also shaped the daily reality for soldiers on the ground, who learned that success often meant finding and destroying material and infrastructure rather than annihilating enemy formations. On April 8th, contact intensified. Patrols from the men of the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, encountered more organized resistance as Viet Cong units attempted to delay American advances and protect their lines of communication. Ambushes were launched along narrow jungle paths, with enemy fighters firing from well-camouflaged positions before disappearing into the foliage. In one engagement, a reinforced platoon moving through dense vegetation was suddenly struck by automatic weapons fire from a prepared position. The enemy had chosen a natural choke point, using the terrain to funnel the Americans into a kill zone. The platoon reacted quickly. Men dropped to the ground, returned fire, and called for artillery and air support. The thunder of incoming rounds shook the jungle as explosions tore through the undergrowth, and the Viet Cong, under the weight of coordinated supporting fires, disengaged and withdrew. Nightfall on April 8th brought a different kind of danger. The battalion established defensive positions, digging into the hard, clay-like soil where possible, setting claymore mines and tripwires, and placing listening posts beyond the wire. Night operations in the jungle were fraught with tension. The enemy often used darkness to probe defenses, to harass with sporadic fire, and to test the resolve of isolated units. That night, sporadic enemy fire and occasional mortar rounds kept men alert. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by radio checks, the distant rumble of artillery, and the constant awareness that any sound could signal an approaching threat. The psychological strain of such nights was as real as the physical exhaustion. Every rustle, every animal call, every distant engine noise could be misread as an enemy movement. On April 9th, the focus shifted toward destroying remaining enemy infrastructure. Engineers were brought forward to demolish bunkers and tunnel complexes discovered by infantry units. These tunnels were often expertly concealed and could extend for hundreds of meters, with storage rooms, sleeping quarters, and escape routes that allowed the Viet Cong to survive bombardment and to re-emerge elsewhere. Clearing tunnels was slow, dangerous work. Engineers and infantrymen had to inspect entrances carefully, probe for booby traps, and use controlled demolitions to collapse passages. The process required patience and a steady nerve. A single mistake could trigger a hidden charge or expose men to close-range fire from concealed positions. Throughout Junction City II, the Viet Cong's strategy of avoiding decisive battle was evident. Rather than risk annihilation, they preserved their forces, dispersed into smaller units, and relied on the terrain and local knowledge to evade capture. This approach reflected a broader strategic calculus: prolong the conflict, inflict casualties and political costs on the Americans, and maintain the ability to fight another day. For U.S. forces, tactical successes, killing enemy fighters, destroying supplies, and temporarily occupying territory, did not always translate into lasting strategic gains. Once American units moved on, the Viet Cong often returned to the same areas, re-establishing caches and command posts when the immediate pressure eased. For the soldiers of the 173d Airborne Brigade, Junction City II was another chapter in a relentless cycle of operations. Days were consumed by movement, reconnaissance, and clearing operations. Nights were spent in defensive positions, listening for signs of infiltration. The physical toll was immense. Heat and humidity sapped energy, insects and leeches were constant nuisances, and the ever-present risk of ambush or booby trap made every step a potential hazard. Men carried heavy loads, rifles, ammunition, radios, water, and personal gear, through terrain that could be unforgiving. The psychological burden was equally heavy. The stress of combat, the loss of comrades, and the uncertainty of when or where the next engagement would occur. Despite these hardships, morale within many units remained resilient. Bonds formed in combat were deep and enduring. Soldiers relied on one another for survival, sharing water, ammunition, and the emotional weight of fear. Leadership at the squad and platoon level proved critical. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers often made life-and-death decisions in the field: when to press an attack, when to withdraw, when to call for supporting fires. Their judgment, training, and ability to inspire confidence under pressure were decisive factors in many engagements. The small unit cohesion that developed in such conditions was a defining feature of American infantry operations in Vietnam. Logistics and medical support were essential to sustaining operations in War Zone C. Helicopters provided the lifeline that allowed isolated units to be resupplied and casualties to be evacuated. Medevac missions saved lives but were themselves risky, subject to enemy fire and weather conditions. Supply chains had to be maintained across difficult terrain, and the coordination of artillery, air support, and ground maneuver required constant communication and planning. The complexity of these operations underscored the modern military's dependence on technology and coordination, even as the enemy sought to negate those advantages through dispersion and concealment. As Junction City II progressed, American forces reported the destruction of large quantities of enemy supplies, rice caches, weapons, ammunition, and medical stores, and the disruption of Viet Cong operations in the short term. Yet the elusive nature of Central Office for South Vietnam and the decentralized character of the Viet Cong command structure meant that the hoped-for decisive blow did not materialize. The Central Office for South Vietnam was not captured, and the leadership and organizational resilience of the Viet Cong allowed them to absorb losses and reconstitute. The temporary disruption of War Zone C's networks did not eliminate the underlying political and social conditions that sustained the insurgency, nor did it remove the cross-border sanctuaries that complicated American efforts. For the men of the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, April 1967 was remembered not as a single, climactic battle, but as a series of tense, exhausting days marked by uncertainty and danger. Individual actions, small patrols that found caches, platoons that repelled ambushes, engineers who cleared tunnels, added up to a campaign of attrition that exacted a cost on both sides. The human stories that emerged from Junction City II were varied. Acts of bravery in close quarters, quiet moments of compassion as medics tended the wounded, the private grief of men who wrote letters home in the brief lulls between operations. The war's randomness, who lived, who died, who returned home, left deep scars on survivors and shaped the memories they carried for the rest of their lives. In the weeks and months after Junction City II, analysts and commanders debated the operation's meaning. On one hand, it demonstrated the United States' ability to mobilize and project overwhelming firepower and to conduct complex, coordinated operations across difficult terrain. On the other hand, it highlighted the limits of conventional military power against an enemy that avoided decisive engagements and relied on political endurance and guerrilla tactics. The operation foreshadowed the strategic dilemmas that would continue to define the war: how to translate tactical victories into lasting political outcomes, how to deny the enemy sanctuary without violating international boundaries, and how to sustain public and political support for a conflict that produced ambiguous results. The legacy of Junction City II for the 173d Airborne Brigade and the men of the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry was both personal and institutional. Veterans carried with them memories of hardship and camaraderie, of leadership tested under fire, and of the moral complexities of fighting in a war where victory was never clearly defined. The operation became part of the broader narrative of the Vietnam War, a story of technological might and logistical prowess confronted by an adaptable, determined adversary who used terrain, time, and political will as weapons of their own. Ultimately, Junction City II was a microcosm of the larger conflict, a clash between a conventional military seeking decisive outcomes and an insurgent force that sought to outlast and outmaneuver. For the soldiers who fought in War Zone C, the operation was a sequence of moments, sudden bursts of violence, long hours of vigilance, the slow, dangerous work of clearing tunnels, and the quiet rituals of remembrance that followed. What remained after the guns fell silent were the memories of those who served, the losses they endured, and the enduring questions about what could have been achieved and at what cost. The men of the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, carried the weight of those days with them, their experiences woven into the complex tapestry of a war that would continue to shape lives and histories long after the last helicopter lifted off the jungle canopy. Beyond the immediate tactical and operational details, Junction City II also revealed the smaller, often overlooked dimensions of warfare that shaped daily life for soldiers and civilians alike. The weather, for instance, played a constant and unpredictable role. Sudden tropical downpours turned trails into rivers of mud, washed out shallow foxholes, and made the movement of heavy equipment treacherous. Heat and humidity accelerated fatigue and made simple tasks, cleaning weapons, drying clothes, preserving food, into ongoing chores. Clothing and boots that were adequate in training proved inadequate in the prolonged wet season. Blisters, fungal infections, and trench foot were common complaints that medical personnel had to manage alongside combat wounds. The equipment soldiers carried was a compromise between mobility and protection. Lightweight rucksacks and minimal personal gear allowed for rapid movement during air assaults, but they also meant that men often lacked comforts and redundancies. Radios were lifelines but were heavy and vulnerable. When a radio failed, a unit's ability to call for artillery or medevac could be compromised. The reliance on helicopters for resupply and casualty evacuation created a dependency that the enemy could exploit by targeting landing zones and flight paths. Pilots and aircrews, who flew repeated missions into contested zones, developed their own culture of risk and improvisation, learning to read the jungle from above and to anticipate where ground forces would need support. Interactions with local civilians added another layer of complexity. Villages in and around war zones C were not monolithic. Some villagers supported the Viet Cong out of ideology, coercion, or necessity, while others sought neutrality or even assistance from American and South Vietnamese forces. Distinguishing combatants from non-combatants in such an environment was difficult and fraught with moral and tactical consequences. Search operations that uncovered rice caches or hidden supplies sometimes disrupted the livelihoods of civilians, creating resentment that could be exploited by the Viet Cong. Civil affairs teams and interpreters worked to mitigate these effects, distributing medical aid, repairing wells, and attempting to win hearts and minds, but the scale of military operations often overwhelmed such efforts. The psychological dimension of the campaign was profound. Soldiers developed rituals to cope with stress, writing letters home when possible, sharing small comforts like a can of coffee or a cigarette, and telling stories to keep fear at bay. Humor, often dark and gallows in nature, became a coping mechanism. At the same time, the cumulative effect of repeated deployments, the loss of friends, and the moral ambiguities of counterinsurgency left many veterans with lasting trauma. The bonds formed in combat were a source of strength, but they also meant that grief and survivors' guilt were shared and magnified within units. Medical care evolved under the pressure of the campaign. Forward aid stations stabilized the wounded for evacuation, and medevac crews became adept at landing in tight clearings under fire. The speed of evacuation and the quality of care en route to larger hospitals saved lives that would have been lost in earlier conflicts. Yet the sight of severely wounded comrades, the sound of distant mortars, and the knowledge that help could be delayed by weather or enemy action were constant reminders of vulnerability. Corpsmen and medics, often young and undertrained for the scale of casualties they faced, performed extraordinary work under fire, and their efforts were a critical component of unit morale. Intelligence gathering during Junction City II combined human sources, captured documents, aerial reconnaissance, and signals intercepts. Each source had limitations. Human intelligence could be unreliable or compromised, aerial photos were obscured by canopy, and signals intelligence required interpretation and corroboration. The elusive nature of the Central Office for South Vietnam and the decentralized command structure of the Viet Cong meant that even when intelligence pointed to likely locations, the enemy could disperse or relocate. This cat-and-mouse game taxed analysts and commanders, who had to weigh the costs of committing large forces against the uncertain prospect of striking a decisive blow. The political context of the operation also mattered. Cross-border sanctuaries in Cambodia complicated the rules of engagement and constrained how far American forces could pursue retreating units. the need to maintain international legitimacy, and to avoid a wider regional conflict limited options, even as commanders on the ground pressed for more aggressive measures. Back home, public opinion and media coverage of the war were beginning to shift, and operations like Junction City II were scrutinized not only for their military outcomes, but for their political implications. The disconnect between battlefield metrics, enemy killed, caches destroyed, and broader political objectives became increasingly apparent. In the months that followed, the lessons of Junction City II were debated in staff rooms and at command conferences. Some argued that the operation demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms and air mobility when applied with precision and persistence. Make sure to subscribe to History Safe for more restored color footage from history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and leave a comment down below. We'd love to hear your thoughts.